When you stand with Israel, you stand for your own values.
If the deal isn't done before I take office, all hell will break out.
I intend to resign as party leader, as prime minister.
Today, we're talking about the US-Canada tariff war and the stark contrast between Trump's America First policies and Trudeau's Canada Last policies. Before we dive in, I think it's important for the purposes of this conversation that I tell you that I'm a citizen of both the United States and Canada. I have a little bit of Canadian goose in me, as well as a bit of that American eagle. I'm going to give you my perspective as a dual citizen living in Canada for the past 12 years. Before I dive in, I want to say that tariff wars are a disaster for both sides. I wish that President Trump would just drop the whole thing altogether. American consumers are going to feel the pinch of higher costs, and Canada's export sectors, such as agriculture and automotive, are going to teeter on the verge of collapse, threatening massive job losses and economic instability. Retaliatory tariffs just make it worse. So with each side digging in, everyone trying to out-tariff the other side, it's a race to the bottom, and it's not good. So my preference is for there to be no tariffs. First, let's try to take a moment to understand how Trump makes decisions. There are two main drivers to his policies: America First, and China is the biggest threat to US national security and American exceptionalism. If you can understand those two things, then you can make sense of most of what he does. You're welcome. Trump is all about making America great again, making Americans richer. The America First principle is embedded in every single one of his policies: trade, manufacturing, national security, immigration, foreign policy, slashing foreign policy, you name it. Trump is laser focused on national interests that keep America on top. With regards to China and the US-China relationship, I'll have more to say on that in another video, but just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, think Greenland and the Panama Canal. Trump wants Greenland for its natural resources and is for its strategic position between North America and Europe. Think Air Force bases and naval bases. And with regards to Panama Canal, Trump wants to stop the Chinese from gaining a foothold in America's made trade routes. Roughly 70% of canal traffic involves shipments to or from U.S. ports, making it a lifeline for the American economy. Trump wants to reposition the U.S. to become less dependent on China, and also wants to beat China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is a global infrastructure and economic development strategy aimed at expanding Chinese influence across the world. Are his policies up for debate? Absolutely. In fact, I highly encourage Trump supporters to push back and ask questions regarding some of his policies. That's healthy. But the man's got a vision, and he's sticking to it. Here's the problem. Countries don't like Trump because he's not playing ball with team globalism. In fact, he stole their ball and is creating a new game and forcing them to play it. Is that mean? Is that harsh? Is that being a bad ally? Absolutely. But if you understand his America First policies, then you would have seen this coming months ago. This is Trump's second term in the White House. People are still in shock that he got elected. Instead of taking measures to align themselves with the incoming Trump administration or even protecting themselves from American dependence, they've been sitting around waiting for something to happen or someone to save them. And this is the point I want to emphasize with regards to Canada-US tariff war. Under Trudeau's leadership, Canada has become weak, poor, and dependent on the United States. Because Trump is a businessman turned world leader, he sees a perfect target for a takeover. Canada has very little leverage to respond. There are a few things that Canada can do to change this reality, but these changes need to happen fast or else Canadians are going to suffer. Let's start with the big picture. Under the current USMCA trade agreement, which Trump negotiated and signed into law during his first term, the US and Canada trade over $2 billion in goods every single day: steel, timber, energy, and lots more. Canada and the US have had great trading relationships up till now. Donald Trump's decision to impose a 25% tariff on Canadian goods is rooted in national security and is a tactic to address non-trade issues like border security and Chinese influence. Until proven otherwise, I'm going with the assumption that Trump truly wants to stop the flow of fentanyl and illegal immigration from Canada and Mexico into the United States. My hope is that Trump communicates very clearly what changes he wants to see in order to drop the tariffs, and that Canada's leadership will find a way to play ball. For two obvious reasons. First, Canada is going to suffer a lot more than the United States. Canada is 1/10 of the US economy, and we won't outlast a trade war. Second is, the more Trump continues to flip-flop on the tariffs, the more investment uncertainty he creates. Investors across North America won't be able to make long-term investment decisions, which will negatively impact the American economy and ultimately erode trust in Trump as a leader. Speaking of eroding trust, Trudeau's weak leadership and progressive policies over the last 9 years have sidelined Canadian national security interests and undermined the country's economy. On top of that, we have another problem, which is lack of competition and access to global markets. First, let's talk about Trump's fentanyl accusation. This is a topic that most Canadians are in denial about, and in fact, Canadian mainstream news and political commentators completely write off Trump's drug accusations against Canada. They say it's a farce, it's a negotiation tactic, it's all smokescreen, but I disagree. Sam Cooper is an investigative reporter that has unveiled deep levels of corruption within Canadian institutions and lots of illegal drug activity. And I can tell you, it's worse than what we know. Unfortunately, most Canadians don't know about this. Canadians have this weird obsession with the American news cycle, but often don't know what's going on in their own country. Comment below if you have an answer to why that is. It's this head in the sand mentality that has allowed a lot of illegal activity to take place without Canadians knowing. Sam Cooper has shown how drug cartels exploit Canada for money laundering through real estate and casinos. In British Columbia, this is known as the Vancouver model. Sam Cooper reveals how Canada's fentanyl crisis, institutionalized corruption, and Chinese espionage are all because of systemic failures in Canada's legal and security frameworks. Are you still quoting that Trudeau line about only 43 pounds of fentanyl a year pass through the US border? Listen to this. This is a quote from a source who's considered a Canadian expert on trilateral partnerships between Chinese triads, the Chinese Communist Party, and the Mexican cartels. The RCMP knows they have no framework within the criminal code, no resources, and no support from prosecution services. They just have no ability. And this whole thing with Trudeau saying that only 43 pounds of fentanyl, less than 1%, is coming from Canada is such a joke. It's the interweaving of trade-based money laundering. If the public knew, it would blow their minds. I believe the US government and Trump know it, and that's why he's doing what he's doing. My personal opinion as to one of the reasons why Canadians so vehemently oppose the idea that we have a drug problem or corruption within our government institutions is because the mainstream media doesn't cover these stories. Largely because they're all subsidized by the government, and you don't bite the hand that feeds you. Before I start sounding like a conspiracy theorist, I just want you to know that this information is out there and it is widely reported on, just not in mainstream media. I'll provide some links below to credible independent Canadian news sites where you can find more information on the topic. Feel free to comment your preferred news source in the comments below. Let's talk about progressive policies for a second. Trudeau's government has vilified Canadian oil and gas and has killed Canada's energy independence. Instead, he's been funding electric car battery plants which are now closing up shop and moving to the States. Projects like Energy East and East-West Pipeline that could have freed Canada from relying on the US markets for oil and gas was scrapped. Trudeau's environmental protectionism has disqualified Canada from global energy dominance. Instead of letting the world have some of our clean, ethically sourced, handcrafted artisanal oil, we restrict our oil exports and make other countries buy oil and gas from Russia and Iran and Venezuela. What a joke. The reason Canada sells oil to the States at a discount is because that's their only viable client. They can't get it to anyone else. Trudeau's progressive policies have made construction of pipelines, exploration of rare earth minerals, and offshore drilling almost impossible. This has left Canada vulnerable to Trump's tariffs. Meanwhile, Trump's pushing American energy dominance.
Drill, baby, drill.
What's going to happen when they don't need our oil anymore? What happens when they find a new source of uranium and potash? Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, is talking about building pipelines east to west. Great. How many years is that going to take? We don't have years, my friends. We need it now. This should have happened years ago. Let's talk about Canadian real estate development. Did you know that it takes between 2 to 5 years, depending on the size of the land, to get fully permitted just to start building? In some American states, you can have the whole project development completed in under a year. I'm telling you from personal experience. The bureaucratic gatekeeping keeps investors away. What about the carbon tax? Trudeau's Liberals believe they are saving the planet by taxing their citizens on the amount of carbon they use. For those not familiar, I'll explain it very quickly. The government charges a price per ton on carbon emissions. This is paid out on anything that is oil and gas. And the idea is to get big companies and individuals to stop polluting. And hopefully they'll make greener choices. The tax is supposedly net neutral, meaning whatever gets collected gets distributed back to individuals in the form of carbon tax rebates. There's two issues with this. The carbon tax only works if every other country is doing it as well. The moment one country taxes its citizens on something, but another country has no taxes on that same thing, then the playing field is uneven. You would think that imposing a carbon tax would actually mean we see less carbon being emitted, right? Wrong. Canada has not met any of its carbon targets. So here we have a tax that reduces competitiveness and makes Canadians poorer. Plus, we're not even meeting our carbon emissions. So naturally, the tax should be scrapped, right? Wrong again. Canada's carbon tax is set to increase by $15 per ton on April 1st, 2025, putting us at $95 per ton, which puts Canada at one of the highest carbon tax brackets in the world. Canadians will be paying about $100 more per person in carbon tax a year as of April 1st. It's true, we get some of that tax back in the form of a carbon tax rebate. Thankfully, I love budgeting, and I keep track of my bills, and I also keep track of how much carbon tax I pay. My December 2023 gas bill was $317. About 17% of that, or $55, was carbon tax. My December 2024 gas bill was $268, lower than last year. But about 38% of that, or $100, was carbon tax. The total amount I paid in carbon tax for the year on my natural gas bill was about $1,230, including harmonized sales tax. Because why wouldn't you put a tax on a tax? In return, I received $1,120 worth of carbon tax rebates, $110 less than what I paid. What about the carbon tax on my gasoline? What about the carbon tax that's driving up the cost of groceries? Where's my rebate for that? The champions of this progressive policy would just say, well, you obviously need to pollute less. And that is what makes Canadians poorer. While we think we can save the world by reducing our carbon footprint, Trudeau is taking his private jet all across the world, whining and dining. Meanwhile, our American neighbors have left the Paris Climate Accords and are burning the midnight fuel to get wealthier. And don't even get me started on the Houthis in the Red Sea that are having a party, creating oil spills and rerouting cargo ships to take the long route to get to their destinations. Does all that go away if I pay more taxes? Canada's self-imposed carbon tax is an interest-free loan to the government that will not save the world from climate change. Canadians are getting poorer, and the economy has become stagnant under Trudeau, while Trump is cutting red tape so that Americans can keep more of their hard-earned money. If I had to advise on a few policy changes, I would say get rid of the carbon tax, get rid of intra-provincial trade barriers, and find a way to get Canadian energy out to the world as fast as possible. Also, I would say cut bureaucratic red tape wherever possible. But here's the big problem. Unlike American capitalism, Canada is very much a socialist oligopoly. Americans hate government overreach and are skeptical when governments say, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Whereas Canadians generally have a high level of trust in government institutions and rush to the government for help when times are bad.
We will be there as needed to help.
This is why America's economy bounced back quicker from COVID lockdowns versus Canada's, which is still recovering. Because of this social structure, Canada has become a playground for oligopolies, a few massive companies in different markets that control the majority market share. For example, telecoms. Bell, Rogers, and Telus own about 90% of the wireless market. Canadians pay some of the highest data rates in the world. In Canadian banking, there are 5 giants to rule them all: RBC, TD, Scotiabank, BMO, and CIBC. They control about 85% of the market. There's barely any innovation in fintech because there's no room to grow. And lastly, the grocers. Loblaw, Sobeys, and Metro take about 60% of the food market share. Why do I bring this up? Because as much as I appreciate this newfound Canadian patriotism and Team Canada and Buy Canadian only, the reality is it's not going to help us win a tariff war. Canada's lack of marketplace competition and high government regulations make it impossible for Canadians to innovate and bring new businesses to the broader market. Canada's got a small population relative to the States, huge amounts of land, and lots of red tape that protect the big players. It's all about keeping things steady, not shaking them up. That's why Canada has supply management systems to protect dairy, poultry, and egg farmers. But here's the catch. Less competition means higher prices, fewer choices, and an economy that's just chilling instead of charging ahead. America's diverse, innovative-driven economy can weather a tariff storm. They can pivot quickly. Canada doesn't stand a chance. When I see American alcohol being removed from the shelves, I think to myself, what are we going to replace that with? Canadians are left with less choices. When I see Doug Ford cancel the Starlink contract because Elon Musk is a friend of Trump, I think to myself, great, more money for the big telecoms and more expensive bills for Canadians. Again, less choice. If Canadians truly care about winning a tariff war, or even better, becoming less dependent on the States, then there needs to be some deep reflection on Canada's leadership and major policy changes that help Canada become more economically competitive. Unfortunately for Canadians, because Trudeau prorogued the government and stepped down as Liberal Party leader, Canadians are at the mercy of the administrative class in Ottawa. Decisions about Canada's future are being made behind closed doors in secret, without Canadians knowing. In the meantime, Trudeau is in his glory, making speeches, acting like the hero, traveling around, making decisions without bearing any responsibility. It's likely that Mark Carney will get elected as the next Liberal leader, meaning he'll be the next Prime Minister of Canada. Hopefully, he'll do the honorable thing and call for an election in order to give Canadians the option to choose who they want for the top job. But until then, there is nothing we can do except for raise our voices and concerns just like I'm doing right now. We need to remind people to think of Canada's future at the ballot box in the next election. I'm going to say it how I see it. It's time for Canadians to understand how far we've fallen as a respectable and investable country on the world stage. There's this notion among the broader Canadian public right now that Team Canada means shut up and fall in line because we're in a crisis. I'll be honest, I have a problem with that approach. I don't believe it's healthy in the long run. It absolves Canadian leadership of their bad policies, and it makes Canadians more tribalistic. Booing the American national anthem is prime example.
And yeah, we're probably going to keep booing the American anthem.
Look, I get it. Trump is to blame for the tariffs. He's not a nice guy. He rubs Canadians the wrong way because he's belligerent, he's forward, and Canadians are polite and quiet. I want both Canadians and Americans watching this right now to understand something very important. As things get harder, the economy gets weaker and unemployment rises, people will look for a savior, and they'll also look for a scapegoat. Be careful not to be so deeply entrenched in nationalistic pride that we become tribal. And we can't forget that at the end of the day, we're all humans created in God's image. It's not us against them. This is about policies and good leadership. Canada, USA, and Mexico could be the wealthiest countries on the planet if their leaders can figure out how to work together. Tell me what you think in the comments. Can Canada successfully make the necessary changes in a short amount of time in order to weather the tariff war? If you're American, let me know your thoughts on the tariff war. Hit that like button, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.